There is a lot to say about the American Revolution. I tried to assign relatively limited reading. I know it's still a lot of reading, but I tried to kind of avoid the military and political aspects of it more. But I am going to talk about that a little bit in this video because I think it's important. And some of this will reflect what was in your book, and hopefully some of this will add to it as well. So, first, the causes of the war. We can date the causes of the war really to the French and Indian War. After the French and Indian War, the British government became much more involved in its American colonies. It had succeeded in largely removing France from the scene. It was more interested, and at the same time, the colonists were used to being able to do whatever they had wanted before, essentially, and that included taking Native American land. Your book, I believe, talks about the Proclamation Act, which was highly controversial among colonists because it essentially said, hey, you need to stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. And even at the time that act was passed, the colonists were already west of the Appalachian Mountains. Um, and as you might imagine, native peoples were not really happy with that, and they would attack these incursions onto their land. And the colonists responded by telling the government, you need to defend us. And so Britain needed to have troops to defend the colonies, and the militaries are expensive. And so, because of that, the British government passed new taxes on the colonies. The colonies have been taxed really little for most of their time, and the British government thought that they were okay with essentially having more taxes because they were taxing them for what they wanted. They were taxing them for the cost of their defense. Additionally, people in Britain paid much more in taxes than colonists did. And so there were many, many acts, and sometimes history courses make you memorize them all. And I do not in a course like this, but for example, the Sugar Act increased tariffs or taxes on sugar. The Stamp Act requires, so essentially every legal document, any legal document or any sort of printed document had to be stamped, that it was licensed more or less. And that included legal documents, but it also included things like newspapers and even playing cards. And so the Stamp Act required all that to be taxed. The Stamp Act, not the Snap Act, bad captions. The Quartering Act required colonists to house and feed members of the British Army for free. And the Townshend Acts taxed paint, glass, and tea. So there were lots of taxes. The colonists did not like that, and they started by boycotting British goods. And that, in fact, the imports from Britain were cut in half because of this boycott. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty is formed. Notable members included Sam Adams, who is arguably the most radical of the so-called founders, and Paul Revere, famous for his midnight ride. In 1768, British forces are sent to maintain order in Boston. Boston was just a breeding ground of hot-headedness. The most radical elements of the colonies were in Boston. And, of course, these troops, under the Quartering Act, had to be fed and housed at the expense of Bostonians, and that made them hate the British all the more. In 1770, the so-called Boston Massacre occurs, and a crowd of 60 townspeople on Boston Common started a snowball fight with British soldiers. Shots were fired. It is unclear who fired first. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, who was a black American. As a result of the Boston Massacre, the British repealed all of the Townshend Acts, all of these tax acts that the colonists hated so much, except for the tax on tea. And the British king at the time, King George III, thought that the colonies should submit to the mother country. The colonists said, no taxation without representation. And so famously, there's the 1773, the Boston Tea Party, where members of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, and dumped tea from a British ship overboard into Boston Harbor. And copycat events actually occurred up and down the East Coast. The British thought this was just an entirely stupid idea, because in Britain, there were plenty of British people in Britain who did not have direct representation in British Parliament. The way the British Parliament worked, is that the House of Commons elected members, but there are so-called rotten boroughs, and a borough is like a congressional district, except in England. And these rotten boroughs, population had shifted; no one lived there anymore, but they were still electing members to Parliament. People usually, often, did not live where they were elected from. Some people did not have a vote at all. Particularly, like no poor person had a vote in England at the time, essentially. So the British said, "What are you talking about? Like, even people in England don't necessarily have direct representation. They have indirect representation, just like you do." And I will also point out, I don't know if I mentioned this later on, but at one point, to compromise, the British told the American colonies, fine, you can elect members to Parliament. And the colonists refused, partially because things were already so far gone, like they were well on their way to revolution, but partially because they realized it wouldn't do any good because the colonies did not have lots of people living in them compared to Britain. And so they would be outvoted every single time. So there was no benefit to them really in having representation. Imperial control breaks down. There is intimidation throughout the streets of Boston. There is public shaming of anyone who is accused of supporting the British or sympathizing with the British. There are acts of violence against those people as well. Various so called committees are formed to plot against England, essentially. And in other parts of the country, pro British people are fleeing to Boston because there are still British troops there. For King George, Massachusetts, again, this sort of head of rabble rousing was key. He wanted Sam Adams and John Hancock to be captured. And of course, Paul Revere's famous ride occurs April 18th, 1775. British troops are sent to Concord to find arms and powder. Paul Revere, and not just him, but also Billy Dawes, alerts the Minutemen, the militia essentially, that the British are famously coming. Revere was caught by the British. He does escape, but he is caught. And in response to the Boston Tea Party, the Brits were not happy, and so they passed what are known called both the Intolerable Acts and the Coercive Acts, and this is in response to the Boston Tea Party. First, Boston Harbor is closed until the tea is fully paid for. That should just be fully paid for. Colonists were denied the right to assemble, essentially, the right to hold town meetings. That was something they had always done. And what really, I think, annoyed people was that any British citizen who committed a crime in America, which would be a British colonist, like if your great great grandparents moved from England to Massachusetts, right, that's still a British colony. You are English. You are British. You're not American. Um, and so you would be brought back to be tried before a British judge in England rather than before a judge in the colonies because they figured correctly that judges in the colonies would be really sympathetic to people who were against the British. And courting British troops was once more established as a requirement. In 1774, the First Continental Congress is held. Um, all of the all of what we would consider the 13 colonies, except for Georgia, sent representatives, and the purpose is to discuss the Intolerable Acts. And they decided to completely boycott British trade. They agreed to stop purchasing goods from Great Britain, and they also agreed to stop shipping um, colonial crops there. So no more shipping of cotton or corn or lumber or tobacco. There are three factions that were roughly equal. Not everyone wanted independence at this time. Um, and so at sort of the Congress as well, there were these three factions. The radicals not only wanted to boycott Britain, they were moving early on towards independence. The middle ground kind of liked things the way they were. They wanted to express their grievances to the king, but they didn't want to cause any problems. And the conservative faction really wanted to keep things largely the way they were, and they wanted to just keep sending petitions to Parliament rather than any sort of boycott against British goods. Meanwhile, the crisis in Massachusetts continues to mount. There's a rumor that a British general is preparing to invade. There's a rumor that the Royal Navy is going to bombard Boston. And the militia of Massachusetts begin to muster, begin to gather in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Continental Congress does pass a boycott of English goods. They also demand that England repeal the Intolerable Acts. There are different plans proposed to um, maintain things, maintain British rule. Joseph Galloway, for example, suggests a Grand Council, and that would co-rule with Parliament, and the King would appoint a Governor General who would be in charge of the colonies. And in a sense, that's kind of how other today British former British colonies act. That's kind of how Canada currently is. Canada has a governor general essentially who stands in for the king or the queen depending on who is in power in England. This is kind of what was wanted by Galloway in the English colonies here. John Adams created a well known at the time Declaration of Rights and Grievances. He argued that the colonists would completely reject taxation. They would support the regulation of quote unquote external commerce, which included trade, but it also included things like smuggling. Um, and then there was an unspoken in here, but a real threat when you read between the lines of rebellion. In Suffolk County, Massachusetts, the Suffolk Resolves held that residents there were supposed to arm themselves and prepare to resist British military action. And it showed to the English that American leaders would choose rebellion if politics failed. And then two quote unquote battles in April of 1775 that became known as the shot heard round the world in sort of American myth, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Neither of them were huge battles, but in Lexington, 8 Americans were killed. And then in Concord, the American militia attacked unsuspecting British soldiers. Notice all this is still before 1776. This is before the Declaration of Independence. Um, and then after these two battles, there's a siege of Boston. The Battle of Concord ends up being a propaganda win for people who want independence. These are the first battles of the American Revolution. They aren't much of battles as battles go. And then in 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets, and its purpose is kind of to ready the colonies for war. There's a request for all colonies to provide troops for a continental army, but there is disagreement about the purpose of the war. Some people want independence. John Adams and Sam Adams want independence. Richard Henry Lee wants independence. Some people want quick reconciliation with England. This is all just a misunderstanding. We're gonna get the band back together. John Dickinson as in that camp, but most delegates really wanted a middle ground. They didn't want the status quo and they didn't want independence. They wanted to essentially establish a system where they would sort of have the rights that they thought they should have and that they thought that they had without independence. At the Second Continental Congress, the only representative there who was actually dressed in military uniform was George Washington, who wore his uniform from the French and Indian War. Washington was named General of the Army. The first offensive victory for colonists was the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga on May 10th of 1775. And here Ethan Allen led the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont in a battle for this fort, which was held by the British near Lake Champlain. And during the next few weeks, the cannon of the fort were removed by General Knox, and they were moved to Boston, where they were in place on a bluff, like a bluff's like a cliff essentially above Boston. And so the cannon peered down on Boston's harbor, and the British then left Boston. Probably the most famous of the early battles of the American Revolution was the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. And this is misnamed in history because it actually took place at what was known as Breed's Hill. The colonists did run out of ammunition, and so they were unable to fend off the British. However, They lost only 130 men, while the British lost 1,000. And so the colonists technically did lose the battle. It was a tactical victory for the British, but it was a victory that came at great cost, and it showed the British that it was perhaps going to be a not an easy victory. In July of 1775, we have the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition is an attempt by the Second Continental Congress to repair relations with England. They agreed to end armed resistance to England if the king withdrew the British military from the colonies and revoked the Intolerable Acts. The very next day, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This is a declaration that is authored by Jefferson and Dickinson, and it accuses the British government of tyranny, but it stops short of declaring independence. There are various conciliatory proposals made by the British. The British Prime Minister, Lord North, said Britain would suspend taxation if the American colonies would pay for their own defense, and the Continental Congress said no. British MPs, MP means member of parliament. It's like what we would call a representative or a congressperson in the U.S. The people who are members of the British Parliament believed that it was far better to keep the colonies as a market for British goods than to lose them in a battle over raising revenue. And so they also tried to create a conciliatory proposal. The Americans rejected any sort of compromise. And so in December of 1775, in the American Prohibitory Act, Britain says that the Royal Navy is allowed to seize American ships that are engaged in any form of trade. This is essentially a naval blockade of the colonies, and it's essentially a declaration of war. And so this ends part 1, and we will continue and pick up from here in part 2.